Okay, um, so today, just sorry, before I start, I'm just going to make this small. So today I'm going to talk around this idea of digital witnessing. And really through this talk, I want to sort of speak, as Lou just mentioned, about the relationship between digital technology and racialized subjects. So what happens when certain kinds of digital technologies are somehow used to sort of understand places, people, situations that are somehow marginalized and particularly racialized. Um, and I guess a lot of this discussion or this thinking is coming from a research project that Lou just mentioned called Topological Atlas, Mapping Contemporary Borderscapes. It's a project that looks at undocumented migration from Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan towards Europe. And we've taken a number of field sites. So we're working at border areas. We started working a few years ago now at the Pakistan-Iran border. Then we are now working at the Turkey-Iran border. And the idea really is to see how the kind of the forced movement of people intersects with border communities, and how lives are lived across borders, so border communities, and again how the securitization of borders to stop the movement of people then affects also border communities. And then we've also been working in the Pakistani megacity of Karachi, which is a place where a lot of the people from Pakistan sort of start their journeys. And then we're also just now, I'm in Istanbul, so we're also working here because this is a place where many people kind of, stop for a while, gather themselves, gather their resources in order to go further to Europe if they are indeed doing that. And one of the things that sort of we're thinking about in this project is that this kind of movement of people that we're looking at is actually a kind of never-ending journey. So it's this kind of way that we conceptualize it as a kind of form of circulation. This is something that a few migration scholars have spoken about, that these are not linear journeys from A to B, but ones that, due to kind of the securitization and the militarization of borders, but also because of the extreme precarious nature of the people who are making these journeys, and also the kind of nasty deportation regimes of, in this case, European countries. It has meant that people are kept in this kind of circulation. So they're deported back. The reasons why they moved have not gone away. So then they move again. So it's this kind of circulatory movement. And so for that reason, we've also been working in a place called Muridke, which is in the Pakistani province of Punjab in the north. Is part of this area called the Gujarat Triangle, where a lot of people who kind of try to make their way towards Europe come from. The vast majority are from there. So these are the few sites that we're looking at. And then the methods that we are doing, using are mostly field research, so interviews, conversations, workshops, with local communities, with people on the move as well. And within these interviews and workshops, we often use visual methods of mapping, of spatial kind of drawing and analysis. And we're also using digital mapping. So that's where the term digital witnessing, the digital comes in there. And then the other thing to say is that when you're working with undocumented or forced migration, then the question of violence is actually never very far away. Whether it's the kind of, the almost physical violence, the very real violence that's enacted on to the people who are moving, the communities at the border as well. Or it also takes the form of epistemic violence, or violence that is about sort of the way the migrant subject or the refugee subject is kind of understood in popular media, but also in some academic discourse as well, and how this kind of way of thinking about a particular subject is also racialized. So the question of violence, of course, then brings in this idea of witnessing, that if a violent act has occurred, how can we witness it? How can we, testify to this thing that has happened? So that's why this sort of project has made me think about the question of digital witnessing. So I'm going to talk about the project right at the end, but first I'm going to talk more conceptually about this idea and then move on to showing you a little bit of work. Okay. So I want to start with just talking about, if we're thinking about digital witnessing, what kinds of, let's say, what kinds of technologies are being used and what kinds of worldviews do those technologies produce. So contemporary visual regimes of modeling and mapping are somehow, I would say, producing representations of worlds that are almost all encompassing. So if you look at this kind of image on the screen, it's a very well-known image. It's the I can't remember what it was, about 10 years ago, this image was released by NASA. It's called the Blue Marble. You will have all seen it, and it's an image that is a kind of composite. So it's made of thousands and thousands of photographs, of satellite photographs that are stitched together to make this almost perfect globe, this blue planet that we live on. So it sort of says something about the nature of contemporary representation and image making that is, not that photographs ever told the truth as such, but these are kind of composite views. They're made from lots and lots of different points of view. And perhaps a better example to show here actually would have been the dark marble, which was an image that NASA released a few years after this one, which showed our planet completely in the dark with lights, being seen where the cities were, so the whole planet was in the dark all at once. And of course, that's not something that happens in reality. So these are kind of images that do certain kind of work in the world. Or we can think about things like computational models that are made from data aggregation, again, taking certain bits of data, certain ways of looking at the world, and then producing what is often seen as a kind of holistic model, a holistic idea of the world. So all of this, I think, gives you a kind of certain sense that we inhabit a world of totalities almost, where the horizon beyond which things might remain uncertain or incalculable seems to have disappeared. And this is, I would say, a very sort of deterministic worldview. And it can, in many senses, I would say, be attributed to these kind of digital technologies of sensing, remote sensing, but other kinds of sensing as well, data analysis and visualization as well. So these are, of course, all technologies that are becoming more and more ubiquitous within architecture. And so I think we also need to kind of engage critically with them and think about what kinds of work they do in the world. So in the context of the witnessing of violence, which is, I guess, what the wider context in which I'm speaking, these kinds of technologies of remote sensing, image making, etc., are being deployed more and more frequently, I would say, by humanitarian agencies and human rights groups, often in the form of remote sensing or the analysis of certain kinds of satellite data, but also looking at images that might have been gleaned from various different social media platforms. And all of them are then again collated together to produce a kind of composite, much like that marble, the blue marble image, to produce this kind of holistic narrative that can sort of act as evidence on acts of violence. And such analysis somehow is sort of aimed at creating compelling narratives of the event for either the court of law or for the court of public opinion. And all of this has somehow contributed towards what has been termed a forensic or an evidentiary turn within the humanities and social sciences. And perhaps, of course, the best known example from our own discipline of architecture of this turn is the group Forensic Architecture, of whom I'm sure you'll all have heard of, who are kind of doing this kind of evidentiary work of producing evidence on acts of violence. And of course, FA are not the only ones that are doing this work. There are many other groups, Bellingcat, Air Wars, and many others who are working in this mode of producing certain kinds of evidence. So I suppose what I want to discuss today is how this very particular form of seeing, what I'm calling digital witnessing, has somehow sort of managed to sort of complicate what was an already incredibly fraught relationship between the practice of witnessing and politicized subjects, and in this case, particularly racialized political subjects. So one, let's say, quite perhaps an obvious example to give is that these kind of composite accounts that I'm speaking of, they rely on data, on stories, on images, videos, all kinds of data gleaned often from social media or from remote sensing, that, is often coming from sort of marginalized viewpoints, or often from events that are happening in the global south, because that's where most of, unfortunately, a lot of these kind of events occur, or certainly they're occurring to people who are marginalized and often racialized. But then the kind of overwhelmingly, I would say that these images or this data is then sort of parsed, analyzed, and made sense of by people who are overwhelmingly located in the global north, and particularly in Europe, actually, in this case. So in that sense, somehow, people are not necessarily telling their own stories, even though their, images, their kind of things that they have produced possibly and put on social media are being used to tell the story. And so I think that this comes with, some of, the, some of the issues that this raises are issues that have already been discussed for a long time within the humanities, but also the social sciences, of, issues that relate to who tells the story and where the story gets told. What are the conditions within which someone can speak, and who is the person speaking? And I would say that often, so the fact that this is now mediated by technology doesn't necessarily change those terms, but certainly complicates the picture a lot more. And again, it is, I think, a sort of condition that sort of it creates the conditions where certain racialized or subaltern subjects recede from view. So talking about kind of, the technological issues at stake, one really obvious one again is this kind of fantasy of a kind of frictionless zooming in and out of far-flung places that, platforms like Google Earth allow us to do, but also the way in which remote sensing or satellite imagery produces, you can see things at a certain scale, but then there's this kind of desire to zoom in more and more, right? So it comes with ideas of security, of surveillance, of, who controls what can be seen and what cannot be seen. Oh yeah, so this was just two kind of important books within this kind of forensic turn, which I'll turn to later. So speaking about, reading traces in the environment, but also reading archives against the grain, which I'll come back to in a little bit. But I wanted next to really talk about some of the conceptual bases that a lot of this work is sitting in, because I think it's important for then how this work is sort of applied in other contexts. So a lot of this work is looking at the more evidentiary kind of understandings of, producing forms of witnessing that come through either reading traces in the environment or through reading archives against the grain. This work is, a lot of it is based on Giorgio Agamben's account of what he calls the paradox of witnessing, and this figure that he sort of writes about, which is called the absent witness. So it's a lot, well, this has kind of been discussed in this book, Remnants of Auschwitz. But within this book, really, Agamben speaks about how within, let's say, a kind of legal sense, there are two different ways in which witnessing can take place. So the first is that, you're a third party to an act. So something has happened and you can claim an outsider's position and say, well, I saw what happened and I can, produce a kind of testimony to what has happened. The other one is that something has happened and you have lived through that particular event. And so you're giving a kind of testimony of something that has happened to you. And these are the two ways in which traditionally you can witness an event or an act. And so Agamben, talking about the very particular context of the Holocaust and particularly of concentration camps, makes this assertion, which I'll read out. It's a quote. So he says, the true witnesses, the complete witnesses, are those who did not bear witness and could not bear witness. So what he's really talking about here is people who had been so completely dehumanized by the atrocities of the concentration camp that, according to Agamben, there was sort of hovering between the edge of life and non-life. And so they were kind of there, but not fully present. And therefore sort of unable to fully witness the events of the concentration camp. So this is where the did not bear witness comes in. And then they were also murdered by the Nazis just before their defeat. So that's where the could not bear witness comes in. And so what Agamben really goes on to say is that there is a kind of absent witness for this particular act that's occurred because the people have not been able to kind of give an account of themselves. And he goes on to say that those who did survive the camp were bearing witness or giving testimony in the stead of the people who had passed away. So really this figure of the absent witness on which a lot of this kind of work that I'm talking about is based, conceptually, this work sort of tells us that it should be based, or it should be used in contexts where there are few or no living testimonies to be sought. And so you look at other kinds of ways of producing evidence. So if I don't have time, so I'm not going to go into why some of Agamben's kind of thinking is contested, but if any of you are interested, you should read this book, which speaks about how this absent witness, conceptually, this idea is not quite right, but I'm not going to go into that. I'm just going to stick with this kind of one point, that, often the absent witness is, if the witness is not absent, what then happens, right? And really, I suppose the problem occurs when such a framework as that of the absent witness is applied in contexts where the living are also there to give an account of their lives. And these are often, racialized subjects. And the reason why I have been thinking about this subject a lot in connection with Pakistan, which is a place where I'm from. This map is of the kind of northern areas of Pakistan. And also it is a place where the kind of early work of forensic architecture was situated. So some of, let's say, the techniques of spatial modeling and narrative that had been developed in the work of a group like forensic architecture were developed in the work that they did in the sort of US-led, in their investigations on the US-led drone bombing of Pakistan and Afghanistan in the context of the so-called war on terror. And I guess Pakistan, or more precisely this area of Pakistan that you see sort of highlighted in this map, which was the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan, sort of constituted, I suppose, a kind of practical case study for the group for sort of working at the limits of what could be seen from the remote sense view of the satellite. So at that time, it was difficult to go into this area. So it would make sense to look through a kind of remote sense view because you couldn't go there. This was the justification for this kind of work. And so the map that you see on here is a kind of pattern mapping of the kind of drone bombings that happened, the number of people who died, the damage that was done or not. And it's produced by forensic architecture, and it's based on the kind of investigations that were done by the Bureau of Investigative Journalists. One last thing as background to say about this particular area of Pakistan is that it had a kind of semi-autonomous status at the time, which was a kind of colonial hangover. So the Pakistanis, that particular place did not have recourse to the Supreme Court of Pakistan. So there was a kind of more local system of justice that also included collective punishment. So it was a very horrible system, actually, that was not removed after Pakistan gained independence. And so this kind of in-between status legally was used by both the Pakistani state and the US to justify the drone warfare. So it was an area that was understood as being in a state of exception in Agamben's terms, legally not within the framework of Pakistan. So I wanted then to turn to this phrase that was written as part of this kind of investigation of forensic architecture within Pakistan, where they sort of say this violence of secrecy, so this fact that you couldn't go into this particular area, practiced not only by the government in the region, so they're speaking about the Pakistani government, particularly here, but also by the Taliban, who were kind of in that area, necessitates for the most part remote sensing in reporting what happens there. Of course, many people still live there, and movement is not entirely restricted, but most journalists are now dependent on information provided by local sources as opposed to what they can see for themselves. So I think the end of this quote is really important for thinking about why certain kinds of technologies are used in certain places and what it means to speak from a certain place. So if we think about who or what counts as a witness, I think it is useful to pause for a moment here on this quote and think about the distinction that is being made between local sources and journalists. So what does it mean to sort of assume that those who have lived through these atrocities cannot bear witness to their own traumas, that they're mere local sources and cannot say what has happened? I would suggest that it is a violent act in itself to discount the stories told by local people of lives that have not only been lost, but have been sort of subjected to protracted violence that continues today in the form of internal displacement, anxiety, and distress and exhaustion. So the kind of long tail of this kind of violent act. So what I suppose the question really is, what are the consequences of deploying a conceptual framework and mode of attending to the aftermath of violence that comes from an engagement with this kind of absent witness, with a witness that's essentially supposed to be dead when the living are also there to sort of give account of their testimony. And, at that time, it was around 2010 when a lot of this work was coming out. There were around 254,000 registered internally displaced people from this area of Pakistan in camps for internally displaced people in places like Dera Ismail Khan, which is outside of this zone in Pakistan. So I don't want to say that evidence of drone warfare was so easily available at the time, but I think it may have helped to turn attention to places where those who had fled the bombings were situated. So I want to sort of think about the fact that the elsewheres of a Western gaze are too many to name, but Dar Ismail Khan would be one of those places, and the displaced people within those camps, who had already somehow been dismissed as, local sources. So what I'm really trying to say here is that the question of turning to a certain kind of way of thinking or only a particular way of thinking can become a little bit dangerous when you think about from which place we are speaking and from which place we are making these images and these kinds of claims. I wanted to sort of also speak about this quote. This is a quote from somebody called Madiha Tahir, an amazing anthropologist, also from Pakistan, who also did her work in these particular areas of Pakistan. And she writes about, the difficulty of getting testimony from that area and the difficulty of doing ethnographic fieldwork in that area. And she says, how stories travel has a lot to do with the truth value. Some travel a long mile to the center, but remain unheard. Some embody centrality wherever they are. And I think, again, this question of how certain kinds of stories are, becoming central, no matter where they are, is important to think about. And I think digital technology does, in fact, play quite a big role in producing some kinds of stories as more central. This image that you see on the screen is actually about the fact that a lot of this work on that particular area of Pakistan also constructs the people of that area as being very abject. So, that they don't have recourse to a certain kind of political representation. Therefore, there is no politics. But this images of the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, which is an extremely strong and well-organized grassroots political movement that came up after the kind of the war on terror and all the drone bombings, etc. So, to look in other ways produces other kinds of narratives. So the missing witness, which is somehow, at the heart of contemporary debates and practices that seek to expand the process of witnessing beyond its traditional focus on individual testimony. They really want to think about viewing testimony as trace found in environments through scientific process, or through sifting or uncovering and reading archives against the grain. So it's not that I have any problem with any of this work. I think it's incredibly important to think through archives and to think and read archives against the grain, as long as we bring these kind of other voices in as well. But in the work that I'm doing at the moment in this project, Topological Atlas, we've been looking at kind of legal testimonies as well and legal cases around undocumented migration. And, the question occurs that what does it archives also look like this image on the screen. So this is a court archive in the Pakistani city of Karachi. And, it's just sacks and sacks and sacks of kind of papers that have just been piled up into a stairwell and then into a room and then somewhere else. So, how do you navigate such an archive? So it's so easy to say, yes, let's read archives against the grain, but sometimes archives look like this. And then what do you do? And I think here, the idea of a guide or someone who helps you navigate through these kinds of places becomes, or through these worlds becomes really important. And certainly I couldn't have found anything in there if it wasn't for the person who looked after this archive. And then the idea of kind of reading traces in the environment, I think, is again incredibly important. But again, as long as you can account for these sort of environmental testimonies beyond the frames of Western knowledge production, right? So a lot of the work that comes from this kind of evidentiary or forensic kind of way of thinking the world tends to use, think about traces in the environment as, for example, chemical traces. So you could, measure the amount of a certain chemical, or think about how the light is changing or how water is being polluted, etc., which is all incredibly valuable work. But I also sort of want to think about how, we can think of environmental testimonies with people who are living in certain contexts, in certain ecologies, with certain environments in very different ways to, let's say, the Western understanding. So this image is from work that we did in the Pakistani city of Gwadar, which is on the Arabian Sea coast. So it's very close to the Pakistan-Iran border, which is why we were working there. And we did a lot of workshops with the Mahigir, the Mahigira, the fisher folk. And sometimes they often, help people cross the border on their boats. But these workshops that we were doing were trying to understand, people's lives across land and sea. So they had very particular ways of understanding their relationship to the land and the sea. And so, to read a trace in the environment from their point of view is totally different, right? It's about how subtle movements in the way the wind blows. It's about subtle movements in the way the water looks and in different seasons, where different fish go, right? So it's a being in the environment or in the ecology which is completely entwined with other beings. And it's also an area where there are a lot of jinns. So jinns are these otherworldly beings who live in probably a parallel dimension to us. They come from kind of Islamic cosmology. And, when you talk to the Mahigir, when you talk to the fisher folk, they speak about how the jinns are there. They help you when you go out onto the water. Certain times you won't go onto the water because of, these other beings who are telling you what to do and what not to do. So somehow I guess what I'm trying to say here is that this kind of reading of traces, of reading of environments, and the kind of listening to testimonies has to become more plural or more multiple. And for sure, it can use digital technologies, but we need other ways to kind of attune ourselves to hear things that people are trying to tell us, and to listen in other ways. And so as a kind of last thing to say here is that we've been so the project is very much thinking with digital technologies, as well as we're sort of thinking about the lives of people who are living near borders, but also how these intersect with the movement of undocumented people. And we're trying to think how we can, and sorry, just to say that the reason for using digital technologies are manifold, but one of the main ones is that digital forms of visualization and ways of thinking borders and border communities and the movement of migration are so crucial to the experience of the people who are living there, because border securitization and things like that use a particular way of looking at the world, a particular form of representation. And so we are producing what we're calling a patchy globe. This is just a kind of mock-up, but we're producing a digital platform that produces a kind of composite of the work that we've been doing, these different stories and narratives that we've been hearing. But as you can see, the patchy globe is composite. It is made of lots and lots of layers, but it doesn't make that perfect whole like NASA's blue marble. It's actually quite difficult to navigate. It's very obscure and opaque. And the point here is much like the court archive that I was speaking of, that here the point is that you cannot navigate a patchy globe without a guide, without certain ways, without certain stories, certain narratives to help you through this kind of entangled space. And so here, you know, different perspectives come together, different scales come together. But if you follow a story and you take on the persona or the kind of the story of somebody, then you can make your way through and you can see things at different scales. So this is work that we're still doing. It's kind of in development, but we're trying to see how we can see these stories through different perspectives. So here again, I think that the question of evidence, or what counts as a testimony and whose point of view we see from and what that does or doesn't reveal, becomes really important to us. So I think that's it, really. I'll end there. Thank you very much for listening.
Sorry, I think we muted ourselves so you couldn't hear the round of applause. But
I muted last year. So
yeah, there was a lot of applause. So thank you very much, Nishat, for that wonderful talk. For everyone in the room and for all of those who are joining us online, we now have about 20 minutes for Q&A. So we can turn up the lights in here. And if anyone online's got questions for us, please feel free to pop them into the Q&A box, and we'll try to go through them, as many of them as possible. Yeah, and thank you once again, Nishat.
Thanks. Hello. Nice to see everyone.
Any questions in the room? Sorry. Oh.
Shall I?
Yes. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. First of all, thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I have a question, I guess, on the romanticization of the inability to access data, and also the ability to, I guess, get access to this kind of information. I find a lot of times in practices like forensic architecture, use these like quite complex programs and create these beautiful images that are really difficult to access, both for the people who they're studying and the people who are trying to study them. And even in terms of kind of like, I guess the digital divide and the ability that, yes, someone may have access to the internet, but they may not have a device that can handle running programs, I guess, that people are using. So I guess I'm asking, how much do you think you're romanticizing this idea of, I guess, creating these beautiful maps that are then inaccessible to the people who you create them, I guess, for and with?
Should I answer this straight away, or how do you want to do it?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, well, first to say, you know, that kind of every form of representation has to have an audience, and so it depends who you're addressing with the work. Certainly, I think in the work that we are doing, there are multiple audiences. So for sure, we want to address a certain kind of westernized audience as well, because it's about, you know, undocumented migration and the vilification of certain kinds of ways of life. So there is something about addressing that. But of course, we also want to, as you say, address the people that we are working with and produce images and stories that are kind of legible to them, where they can see themselves in it, right? So actually, we just had a workshop with the project team, and we were talking about this patchy globe and sort of thinking about how we can make it more legible for the people whose stories are in it. And one of the things that we're turning to is trying to think with Islamic cosmology, because all the people we're talking to are Muslim. And in Islamic cosmology, the globe is held up by mountains, right? And it's not, you're always under the sky, which is held up by mountains. And there's this kind of very particular connection with the land and the sea. And so you never see a full globe. So we were thinking that actually the patchy globe would be something that you see from the inside, that would speak about how the world can be represented and thought of differently if we look at it from, for example, the Islamic world. So in that sense, I'm not really answering a question about, whether or not, people will be able to access this if they don't have, let's say, internet or whatever. But, I think for us, it's also a matter of producing kind of paper-based material that can be then, talked over with people, and we ask them, what do they think of the things that we're making? So we've made a series of maps of the particular places where we're working, printed them out, and we go back, and we are going to go back soon and ask people to sort of draw over them. So I think, yeah, there's always a limitation with digital technologies, but it depends on the audience. And I think for me, it is important to think through the digital, because the digital is the space where a lot of decisions are being made, and a lot of forms of representation are kind of talking about the lives of people, right, that we're dealing with, even if those people don't have access to those same images. Digital forms of representation are absolutely complicit in the kinds of decisions that are being made about migration, for example. So using those against the grain, I think, is important, even if I don't think they should be super flashy images like the ones that you were just talking about. But I think there's work to be done there, and I'm not sure that we are quite getting there yet either.
Before any other question in the audience, we have one online from Moise Mangwana, who asks, digitizing information such as art or history is like an encyclopedia, but can it be like a microblogging to have a mix of modern architecture and Islamic architecture versus climate change?
Quick answer is yes. Maybe you could explain your question a little bit more. I think that absolutely you can, you can. I don't think I totally get your question. Do you mind just explaining a little bit more what you mean?
Moise, if you're still with us, actually, we can allow you to unmute, I think, so you can ask your question directly. Let's see if this works.
I guess maybe you're talking about having small little accounts from different perspectives. Is that what you're saying?
They may not be with us anymore. So we can.
Comparing architectural design and climate change. I think multiple points of view, Burj Khalifa. I don't know what to say about Burj Khalifa, other than, I don't talk about buildings, God knows, I don't know. Shrine of Imam Hussein of Makkah. Are you saying that these things should be thought of together? Is that what you're saying?
Moise, we're going to pick up another question if there's any in the room. If you'd like to write a little more about your question to get it maybe developed a bit, answered by Nishat, please feel free to keep writing. Is there anyone else in the audience who has any question?
I'm happy to ask. I hope it will be a clear question. I'm still not sure. So first of all, thank you for the fascinating talk, and particularly interested in the methods that you use. And you discussed the topological atlas as an alternative atlas that produces, these forms of alternative images of border, these images which we could look at them as multiple and also obscure, and this is, not an opposite, but a sort of an alternative to the zoom in process that you discussed or described in the beginning. And I wonder if we talk about, it's a very broad brush question. If we talk about this kind of zooming in as a sort of a more, of a will for accuracy and this kind of scientific evidence, and if we talk about the alternative atlas as this form of less clear way of understanding the world in order to create this multiplicity. Would you think about it like sciences or social sciences as also a form of art or work of art, which is curated and created by many? And if so, what is the value of thinking about it? Or is there a value anyhow in thinking about it in such a way? So a work of art which is a product of research.
Yeah, I think of it as art-based, let's say, rather than a work of art. But I think the value of doing this kind of work is that, especially in, doing work on migration, especially, we know that producing evidence about atrocities, about the awful situations that we are in, does not change anyone's mind, right? So it's not a matter of, giving more data, giving more kind of, accounts. It's about sort of reframing questions in a different way. It's about producing certain kinds of accounts that lets you see the world in a different way. And I think that is absolutely crucial for these kinds of very protracted questions that are heavily politicized, where, there are binary sides, etc. So I think that's the kind of debate in which this work tries to intervene, and which then goes back to that very first question. Why are you producing maps that are maybe fact, that we want to intervene in debates that are also happening within the global north or the west? So there are kind of these multiple audiences.
Thank you very much for that. We lost you a little bit there, but hopefully it will stabilize. But we got the gist of what you were trying to say.
Okay.
We have one more question in the Q&A. I'll just read it out for you. From Rihab. Fascinating talk. I wonder if you could say a bit more about how digital technologies can be used to give voice to the stories and narratives of marginalized people, and what innovative methods can be used for data collection and dissemination. You mentioned doing interviews and focus groups or workshops. Are there other methods that you have used in collecting stories?
I think, one of the things about doing field research is you just need time, right? You need time, and you need to collaborate with others who, especially when you're working in multiple sites like we are, others who know the place perhaps better than you do. And then it depends kind of the kinds of sites you're working in. So Gawada, this place that I was talking about earlier where the fisher folk were, that's a place where it's very difficult to spend a lot of time. And so there, we had decided that we would come back a few times. So I think coming up with kind of modes of engagement with your field that are kind of specific to that place. Sometimes, you can spend a month in that place if you have that kind of time and really try to understand what's happening. But there are other times when that is simply not possible, whether it's your own kind of personal life or certain conditions in the field. And there, I think, to really sort of design your engagements where you might collaborate with people who are already there, maybe researchers or students who are already there. So one thing to say about the Gawada work was that we worked with a group called Lajford. They're a group based in Pakistan, and they do this kind of visiting schools method. So Zara Hussain leads this group, and they do these kinds of 2-week field schools in different sites where they bring people, students and academics and artists, etc., from all over Pakistan to a particular place, and they work there for 2 weeks, and then they come back and they continue the engagement more remotely. And I think that kind of work is incredibly helpful. In terms of digital methods, I mean, I think you can there are two things. You can use digital methods to collect data, for example, whether you want to record things, whether you want to do walks and, record where you go, photographs, etc. But you can also use digital methods, and I think this is more of what we're doing in Topological Atlas, where we use digital methods as a form of representation, where we critique the tools that we are using. So we try to use GIS platforms in ways that they're not supposed to be used. So we try to break them often and try to see what kinds of representations they would produce. So here, I think especially when you're using digital methods, it's okay to be a little bit irreverent to what they were made for, because often the ethics of their working is usually quite bad. So just break them and try to use them against the grain. It can be helpful in producing surprising results.
Fantastic.
Unless there's any other question in the audience, then we are reaching the end of, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering, how do you sort of navigate the bridge between an individual story, which can be very powerful and emotional, and then kind of zooming out and seeing that story as one data point in amongst hundreds of millions of others? How do you bridge that relationship so that the stories don't get lost?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one that I don't necessarily have an answer to. Again, this last week, we've been sat together trying to come up with narratives of particular places. So I think this is what we've decided. Originally, we were making kind of narratives from particular point of view, so from the migrant, from the agent, from the border official's point of view. And we realized exactly that it was doing this work of kind of homogenizing experiences into a kind of archetypal experience of a migrant, which was not very helpful. And so what we decided instead to do was to produce narratives of particular places where these different people come in and they have certain kinds of, relationships or certain things happen to them. And that way you sort of, in one place, how people intersect and act with each other. And we were doing kind of visual narratives with maps as well. Suddenly you can bring in stories from lots of different perspectives. So the story of different border officials can be brought in. And yeah, it doesn't have to be one person's story, then you can bring them all together. So yeah, site-based seems to work.
Maybe to pick up on that, I guess it was really interesting to hear you speak about these different point of views mapping a larger story, because I guess a lot of the times I was working at the US-Mexico border last year, and a lot of the times when I was there and speaking to people and doing a lot of engagement, I realized a lot of those stories were contradictory to what we think they may be. So Border Patrol agents aren't always white Americans. A lot of the time they might be second generation Mexicans or second generation immigrants, or newly second generation Mexicans might actually not want migrants to come in through the border. And there were so many of these stories that I think we sometimes homogenized because for a positive reason, right? But then we end up losing a lot of these points, which I guess was a lot of the previous question. And I wonder, I found it very hard through an academic output to be able to convey that complexity. And I guess the reason why you resort to this artistic form might be because of that as well, because it gives so much more room for these things to overlap and for one truth to be multiple truth instead of just a one-sided coin, I guess. But maybe, I don't know if you could tell us about your experience in academia, of how was your journey of finding the right mediums, if you feel like this is the right medium or not.
No, absolutely. I think what you said is so true. So in the beginning, when I first started the project, which was about 4 years ago, I used to talk about, the kinds of things that we were finding out in the field, and, sort of trying to say that, it's a very delicate thing to say that, the migrant subject is not the perfect victim for humanitarian redress, right? And yet the door is still open, right? So imperfect subjects should still be given asylum, all of that. So these questions, especially in certain kinds of activist contexts, when you say them, you get a lot of blowback because it's like, well, you know, why are you doing this? Are you against asylum? And it's like, well, no, of course I'm not against asylum. But that people hold multiple subjectivities within themselves, and sometimes they're performed, you know, for the border guard or for different kind of contexts that they're in. And so absolutely bringing in a kind of fictional narrative, a speculative narrative, one that brings together different points of views and shows the complexity of certain situations, I think is incredibly helpful. And so these different places that we are mapping where these, you know, similar characters are appearing, they behave differently, right? You know, a person in the Pakistani city of Karachi would be very different. The same person would behave very differently when they're in Istanbul, etc. So, yeah. And I think this is where kind of fictionalizing a little bit and speculating a little bit gives you the room to deal with these kind of incredibly difficult issues and to test things.
Thank you. We have another question from Rehab who says, oh, sorry, maybe just a comment. My colleagues and I are currently looking at video diaries as a form of participatory research method. It's challenging, but we hope they can be a really useful representation.
Nice. Absolutely.
Well, if there's no other question, we might be able to close this. Do you want to do the finishing? I can show the term card as well. Thank you so much, Nishat, for joining us. This was such an enlightening talk. It's so relevant to so many of us as well who are about to embark on field work or have just come back from field work. So thank you so much for that. And I'll just briefly share the term cards. We have one last event for the term. I will just put it up. And for those of you who have any further questions for Nishat, please feel free to email us on the decolonize email, and we can pass on over these questions. Otherwise, we invite you to join her project's websites, which I'm just going to paste in the chats here. And thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us for our final talk. And thank you, Nishat, for a wonderful presentation.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, everyone.